In this module, you're going to learn about Aristotle and Aristotelian natural philosophy. Aristotelianism was the dominant philosophical paradigm for understanding nature in Europe, and to an extent in the Arab world throughout the ancient and medieval periods. So dominant was Aristotle's system of thought that he was known among medieval Christian scholars as simply the philosopher. As G.E.R. Lloyd puts it, to attempt to cover the history of Aristotle's influence on subsequent thought in full would be not far short of undertaking to write the history of European philosophy and science, at least down to the 16th century. End quote. That's a lot to ask of you in one module. So I just want you to know I'm not expecting you to digest the entire history of European philosophy and science through the 16th century. But I am hoping you get introduced to the Aristotelian world in such a way that lays a foundation for future learning. I also know that medieval natural philosophy isn't everyone's cup of tea, that even when translated from its original Latin into English, it still somehow feels like it's written in Latin. But if you slow down and take the time to understand what, say, Nicole Rim is talking about, you might just catch a glimpse into a world that somehow, paradoxically, made knowledge in a way that is completely different from your own, and yet also evolved into your world. Okay, let's dig in. Grant begins by introducing us to the puzzle over Aristotle's scholarship. Did Aristotle personally write the texts we now attribute to him? Were they essentially transcriptions of lectures he gave to his students, compiled by those students? Were they his own lecture notes assembled into books after the fact, or perhaps rough drafts? When Aristotle died, his library, including the texts in question, passed to his friend Theophrastus, who took over Aristotle's school, the Lyceum. Theophrastus eventually passed control over to his nephew, Neleus, who relocated the library to Asia Minor in modern-day Turkey. Neleus buried the library in a cave over there, where it sat for 2 centuries before being dug up and transported back to Athens and then to Rome. There, the Aristotelian philosopher Andronicus of Rhodes took possession of the well-traveled hoard of texts, and from it compiled the complete works of Aristotle in around 70 BC. A lot can happen in the 250 years from the time Aristotle died to the time Andronicus got a hold of those texts, and a lot more can happen in the 2,000 years from the time Aristotle died to the late 19th century when scholars started questioning the authorship of those texts. When we hear from the historian Jonathan Barnes that Andronicus himself composed the texts we consider to be written by Aristotle, it defies everything we take for granted about authorship and authority, what it means to be the person responsible for a text and the ideas it contains. Under our current model, books are published then if the author has more thoughts on, say, volcanoes, they simply write another book about volcanoes. In that way, any given book represents the incompleteness and imperfection of the author's knowledge, and by extension, the author themselves, throughout their life. The way Aristotle's books were composed and recomposed, however, suggests that those books were not allowed to remain in their state of imperfection, but each was dragged along the intellectual journey taken by Aristotle throughout his life, constantly updated so as to be less incomplete and more imperfect. Then, when Aristotle died, his books represented not what he knew about their subject at the moment they were first composed, but instead each represented the sum of Aristotle's knowledge on their subject matter that he developed over his entire life. This method of recursively editing text to reflect the evolution of the knowledge they contain is effective at conferring authority upon the text, but it creates a problem for historians. If the texts are repeatedly edited and we have no record of the edits, only of the final product once the editing eventually ceased, then we have no way of coming to understand how Aristotle's philosophy evolved over the course of his life, how new ideas influenced old ones, and vice versa. It is product over process, and historians are interested in the process. We want to know how things came to be as they are. These two very different types of publishing reflect two different epistemic value systems. One treats knowledge as a noun, something to be acquired that accumulates over time, that is valuable in and of itself. The other treats knowledge as a verb, not a thing, but a process, not a destination to be arrived at, but a journey to be taken. Barnes is quoted in this chapter as saying that it makes no sense to provide a chronology of Aristotle's writings. Being unable to trace the changes in Aristotle's thought, to chronologize his texts, makes it very difficult to historically understand Aristotle. His work and his philosophy take on a timeless, immutable quality, which might help explain how they persisted as the dominant natural philosophical system until the 16th century. Let's discuss one particularly stable and stubborn aspect of his natural philosophy, his structure of the cosmos. For Aristotle, the universe was divided into two realms, the terrestrial and the celestial. The terrestrial realm was everything under the moon and was a realm of constant change and flux, impermanence, generation, and decay. The celestial realm existed beyond the moon, including the planets and stars. Accordingly, because comets were temporary and fleeting, Aristotle believed them to exist below the moon, in our sky. He believed that the celestial realm was composed of the quintessence, literally the fifth element, while the terrestrial realm was composed of the four common elements of earth, water, air, and fire. The earth was the center of this cosmos and was surrounded by a series of concentric ethereal spheres that held the planets and turned around the earth. This obviously is not how our cosmos is actually composed. However, and this is one of the most important principles in the history of science, we don't measure the historical significance of historical figures with the yardstick of the present. Scientific consensus is always changing, extending itself and pruning itself. What is fact today may be modified tomorrow, as Newtonian mechanics was modified by relativistic mechanics. Instead, we evaluate the historical significance of historical figures within the confines of their own historical context. Did they matter to their peers, to their successors? Were their ideas transformative on their own world? Not would they be transformative on ours. Aristotle's ideas resonated through philosophical debates for millennia and across many cultures, and we better understand those times and cultures, and our own that arose out of them, by understanding Aristotle.